Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jagushini Mondol, the current co-president of the Oxford University History Society. I'm a DPhil student here at the History of Science and Medicine department. We are honored to have Professor Amit Chaudhuri with us today in our first book discussion event. We are immensely grateful for your time, Professor Chaudhuri. Professor Amit Chaudhuri is the author of 7 novels, as well as 3 books of essays, 3 of poems, a collection of short stories, and a critical study of D.H. Lawrence's poetry. In 2013, he became the first person to be awarded the Infosys Prize for outstanding contribution to the humanities and literary studies. He has received the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Betty Trask Prize, the Encore Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction, and the Indian government's Sahitya Akademi Award. Along with being an extraordinary author, he is also a singer and music composer, having received Shongit Chamman by the government of West Bengal for his contribution to Hindustani classical music. He has also been here last year for his performance in an event organized by Torch, which I had attended and was equally enthralled. An honorary fellow of Balliol College, Oxford. He is currently the director of the Center for the Creative and the Critical, Ashoka University, India. Today, we are going to be in conversation with Professor Chaudhuri about identity, history, and belonging in his recent book, Sojourn. This is the book. The session will be an hour long. And again, Professor, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you. Something happened to her connection.
I think she's just left the call for a minute. So okay, she's back. We're good.
Sorry for the technical glitch. So as I was saying, I'll read out the excerpt of the book before we get into the questions. An unnamed man arrives in Berlin as a visiting professor and finds a city fused with troubled Western history and cultural fracture lines. He moves along its streets and pavements, through its department stores, museums, and restaurants. He befriends Fakhrul, an enigmatic exiled poet, and Bridget, a woman with whom he shares the vagaries of attraction. He tries to understand his white-haired cleaner. Berlin is a riddle. He becomes lost not only in the city, but in its legacy. As his tenure passes, the narrator's growing absorption in his surroundings is accompanied by a loosening of his grasp on memory, and yet the less certain he is of his place in the world, the more he knows his way. So my first question would be to focus on, how language becomes one of the central themes in your novel, Professor Chaudhuri. To quote a bit from your book, the professor in the novel is saying that, what I could overhear, certain German words like danke, I couldn't follow, sounded exactly like Bengali. While the white-haired cleaner in the professor's flat spoke German, and he did not understand a word of it. This word I understood, the others I didn't, but I could hear each one distinctly. Despite that, the professor felt reassured. Happy, she was happy. What was most amusing to me was while what the cleaner was actually saying was, the washing powder is almost empty. Don't worry, I'll buy a new one. So you have talked about how sound is important to you in your literary work. So I have 2 questions. One is the reference to the non-familiarity with language a conscious choice with respect to losing one's identity in an unfamiliar city? And the other is a bit more straightforward, is how do soundscapes play a role in your idea of belonging in the novel?
Soundscapes. Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. Did you, by the way, did you put her German into Google Translate? I mean, how did you find out what she's talking about?
I asked a German friend.
Okay.
Who I read the novel with. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Right. Yes. So I too had to get the help of friends who knew German or German friends in order to sort of come up with her bit of the cleaning lady's bit of the dialogue.
Mm.
I used Google Translate myself, and it didn't work in the sense that I couldn't rely on it, and got it checked and finally arrived at these sentences. So I went to Berlin for a brief visit in 2004, and then I went again in 2005. I was there from late 2005 to early 2006 as Samuel Fisher guest professor in Free University Berlin. However, I did not lose my memory, and think I was an East Berliner. So this is not me in the novel, although of course there are things that I picked up on those visits, including sort of ideas and inklings and intimations that go into the novel. Now, one of the things that that I share in common with the person in the novel is that I don't know any German except for one or two words.
Mm.
Berlin is such a city that you can get by without knowing German, and in fact the effect of globalization is such that you can, I think, get by in quite a few European cities without knowing the languages they speak in them, which would have been quite different, at least in the case of certain Western European cities before globalization happened. And one of the things I heard on the 2004 trip was that East Berliners didn't speak English. People from the former east of Germany, and the memory of that was still fresh. Of what it meant to live in a divided Germany, there was some kind of jokey references to the fact that Easterners, as they were called, or East Berliners, East Germans, didn't speak English. I found it curious. I mean, I'd also been to Cologne, my country, in the 90s, and I did find it curious that Germans who spoke English prided themselves on being able to speak English well. So it was a kind of, it seemed to me, I mean, in a certain way, superficially kind of quasi-colonial mindset, on another level, completely not, of course. And that led to those jokey references about East Berliners not being able to speak in English. And so the cleaning ladies from the East of Berlin, which is why we are having I'm lapsing into not pathetic fallacy, but anyway, identifying myself with my characters, but which is why this man is having a conversation with the cleaning lady in which he's speaking in English and she replies in German, and that's because she doesn't know any English. If he had been having this conversation presumably with somebody from the west of Berlin, maybe, I mean, they would have known some English. I kind of felt liberated in Berlin by not knowing the language that was spoken there. And so I'm speaking for myself. And that led to what you call, my receptivity to soundscapes, to sort of, be able to kind of attend to various things which maybe I wouldn't have if I had been in a place where I had understood what people were saying. So the fact that I didn't understand most of what was being said around me meant, firstly, that I was liberated from the various obligations that have to do with being in a milieu in which you understand what's going on, which is your natural habitat. You are freed from various obligations when you're no longer. So there is confusion maybe, but there's also freedom. When you are not kind of in a milieu where you understand the language. And the other thing is, of course, I began to listen more to language and other things, not for meaning, but for sound. So, so once I began to listen to things as if sound had meaning, rather than words representing meaning, then of course you begin to listen to everything in that way, not just people speaking, but sounds you hear on the street. One of the earliest kind of creative responses I had to this sort of experiencing this kind of reality in Berlin was in 2005. I used to take the U-Bahn constantly and go towards Wittenbergplatz, and I used to listen to the train for the sounds it was making. And I used to listen to it for the kind of notes that it seemed to sort of be sounding, So when the train stopped, it made a vibration which I took to be a kind of tonic, in a scale. And then a woman's voice said, "Einsteigen bitte," step in. And then there would be two warning notes, which I measured against the tonic, and they were the fourth and the fifth, or in Indian notes, ma and pa.
Really?
And then the voice would say, "Zurückbleiben bitte," meaning, stand back, step back, or stand back. And then the doors would close, and then the train would start, and the hum or the vibration would then become a higher pitched hum, and it would cover an entire octave. And I created a song out of that called Berlin. And this came about because I think I was in a city where I was listening for sounds. I was not listening for meaning in the way you do when you're in a city where you understand the language. Similarly, I would say that, there was another song I also wrote at that time called Moths. Moths is a newspaper sold by homeless people in Berlin, just like the Big Issue is sold in England. So these homeless people would come onto trains sometimes to sell the latest copy of Moths, and they would be pitching the newspaper to the commuters who would be ignoring them. And I remember this guy began to speak in this kind of sing-song, telling the commuters why they should buy his kind of a copy of Moths. And the sing-song reminded me of a Venga Boys tune, which I didn't even know that I'd ever heard. And then, so I created a song called Moths, incorporating this tune from the Venga Boys, which I'd been reminded of by this man speaking in a language I didn't understand. I was just following the tonality of what he was saying. So what I'm saying is that a creative response of a particular kind begins to happen when you don't understand what's going on. And certain sort of things begin to, other kinds of meanings, which are not kind of conventionally part of linguistic meaning, begin to open up. And that happened with the songs. I think German language then continued to fascinate me in that way. Maybe French wouldn't fascinate me in this way. The sound of German continued to fascinate me, and that's why I wanted to have those sections in the novel where somebody's speaking in German and speaking at length, or at least at some length in German, and the other person doesn't understand, but is hardly disturbed by not understanding it.
This is absolutely fascinating to know. And it's very interesting when you mentioned the quasi-colonial reference. Would you say that that is something that also underlines when the professor thinks that some of the sounds that he does not understand, they sound like Bengali, because, here the professor does not have any inclination towards music per se, which you have. So that's where I think the narrator is different from, what someone might mistake the author for.
As I said, I didn't lose my memory. I mean, maybe I'm doing it now, but not
Yeah.
when I was in, yeah.
So one of the most compelling sentences in the novel for me was when the professor is saying, "I felt a deep sense of homecoming. I didn't know where we were." What characterizes homecoming in an unknown city for you, especially because we see cities being portrayed in many of your novels, which we will talk a bit more about in this discussion. So what characterizes homecoming in an unknown city for you?
Well, I began to feel a sense of familiarity in various cities and a sense of unfamiliarity with other cities. And none of this was based on whether I knew the city well or not. The sense of familiarity or unfamiliarity didn't have anything to do with how well I knew the city. The kind of Bombay that I grew up in South Bombay, I found kind of on some level kind of deeply unfamiliar to me. So I was growing up in tall buildings in flats on the 12th story, 25th story. Especially when we moved to Cuff Parade, that place seemed entirely alien to me, because it was all kind of land that had been reclaimed, and Cuff Parade had just come up, in the 80s, 70s, 80s. Early I was in another part of the city, and yet compared to my uncle's house in Calcutta, in Bhawanipur, it still felt unfamiliar where I was in Bombay. In Bhawanipur, in my uncle's house, in that lane, I felt a kind of sense of the familiar, which was also infinitely surprising.
Yeah.
And therefore had a quality of foreignness to it. So they were not in two different categories somehow. I felt a deep sense of kinship with Bhawanipur and that lane in Bhawanipur. And yet, because it had a sense of mystery, I can only surmise that there was also a kind of fund of foreignness, but not in a negative sense, built into that lane, into those houses, which I found fascinating, but I also found familiar. Now, what was it about that particular lane which attracted me? So when I was growing up in Bombay, as I said, I would be in tall buildings. I would look out onto the Arabian Sea. I couldn't hear very much of the kind of, the cars and street life far below. So the soundscape, again, to use your word, was missing. In my uncle's house, I would look out onto other houses, and there was a train tracks beyond the houses opposite, so we could hear the train going past. We could hear sounds, and sounds immediately brought to us the presence of what we could not see. So we return to this whole business to do with what a soundscape does in our lives, or a soundtrack. And what it does quite often is that it comprises the incursion of the unseen into our lives, and that happens from moment to moment. So only a small percentage of what we hear, at least in India, can be seen. Most of it is invisible. So we are constantly being made aware of the proximity of things which are there and which are busy in their own world, but which we cannot actually see with our own eyes. That I liked, that sense of ramification. I liked that about Bhawanipur. I liked other kinds of ramification that, these 2 or 3 storied houses with open rooftops looked out onto other 2 or 3 storied houses with open rooftops. This, to me, was more interesting than the kind of Arabian Sea, which I looked out on from my balcony in Bombay. And so I would say this vision of rooftops and the incursion of momentary occurrences of sound, to me, felt familiar. It felt deeply familiar, but also it had mystery and so felt foreign as well, but foreign in a way that I was happy with. I felt happy with that foreignness. It was not alien to me in the way we usually think of foreignness. So now, I've only talked about this to say that when I go to other cities, I find myself maybe unconsciously deciding whether it is familiar or unfamiliar to me on these principles. So I don't think to myself, how far am I from where I was born, in order to decide whether the city feels familiar or alien to me. If I discover within it, or if I happen to discover within it certain neighborhoods and streets, which again set off that sense of recognition in me, and also a sense of the mystery of that particular place, I think to myself, this is familiar to me. I feel at home here, although I don't know this place. In other places, like let's say maybe Atlanta or Dubai or wherever, I feel this is deeply alien to me. So it doesn't matter whether Dubai is closer to India than Atlanta, it still feels alien to me. So I don't look at cities according to which country they belong to or how close they are geographically to where I grew up. I look at it on the principles that I've mentioned. So it means on some level, one can discover something deeply familiar in a place you have never been. And maybe that discovery has something to do with history itself, the kind of history that has formed us. And this is what I'm exploring in this novel.
This is such a beautiful answer, and how you tied both. And I read your post a few days back about, because you mentioned rooftops, about windows around Calcutta, and that was fascinating to know these elements. And because you mentioned Mumbai in the novel, what was very interesting for me to see is that both the close friends that the professor makes, they disappear at some point. And there has been this feeling of dislocation in the protagonist of your novels visiting a familiar or an alien city, borrowing your word, like Mumbai in Friend of My Youth, London in Odysseus Abroad, and Berlin in Sojourn. So however, what appealed to me was that in Sojourn, the professor never admits to his loneliness. Would you say then that the journey between dislocation and losing track of his own identity is the sojourn in your novel?
The narrator doesn't admit to loneliness or sense of dislocation because he doesn't feel dislocated. I mean, as I said, he feels deeply at home, although he's lost. And I've just tried to tell you why this might happen. While you might feel lost in a place you're, on some level, you should be more familiar with, lost in the sense of not feeling ill at ease over there. While over here, I'm looking at somebody who's feeling more or less at ease with being lost. And also this loss is connected to loss of consciousness. Seems to feel, he doesn't seem to feel disoriented or disturbed by the fact that he's losing a grip on his memory or his grip on the present. that could be because a true sense of absorption, which might be an absorption in place or an absorption in history or an absorption in an artwork or an absorption in a piece of music, entails a momentary or at least a temporary loss of self-consciousness. One is no longer conscious when one is absorbed, conscious anymore of who one is. One is absorbed in the object of absorption, you know. So so when we lose ourselves in a piece of music, for instance, or when we lose ourselves when we are looking at the balcony of a house far away, which fascinates us, we don't feel disoriented by our loss of ourselves during that period. We feel completely at ease with this loss. In fact, we want that loss.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah. That's again so beautiful, to think, because I never thought that, he was actually wanting that loss. And, you just mentioned about moments, and you are known to specialize in the, art of the moment. And Sojourn, at least from my own understanding of the novel, is full of such moments. But is there any particular moment in the novel that you want to talk a bit more about?
Is there any particular moment in the novel?
Or generally?
Well, I mean, there are so many moments. I mean, I think there are so many moments of productive confusion in the person's kind of experience of what's going on. One of them is when he's gone to this kind of restaurant and what used to be a ballroom in East Berlin, and Birgit says to him that, these people used to come here to dance when this was East Berlin and East Germany. And he thinks to himself, these people, does she mean that these people in front of me are the same people who used to come to dance then? Where then am I at this point in history? Has the wall not fallen? Am I still there? I mean, am I then part of this in some way? I mean, the narrator doesn't spell it out like I'm spelling it out now. There is another such moment. Fakhrul is kind of taking him on a tour of the environs of Hakishar Markt, and they go through a passage, and there are those buildings in which Jewish people lived and were deported, and to mark those kind of that particular moment in history, you have those things, those metal kind of
on the floor of
on the paving stones, embedded in the paving stones. There is a particular term for it, stumbling stones or something like that. In German, I cannot remember the exact word now, and I don't want to, get it wrong. But Fakhrul says to the narrator, these people, he's pointing to the building, these are the people who live, and the narrator thinks, no, but those people were deported. They cannot be the same people over there. Again, there is that momentary confusion, which then puts into doubt historical narrative as we understand it. History is something you experience in various ways. You experience it sometimes non-sequentially. It does not always happen that history firmly belongs to the past, and the only way to feel its immediacy, that is, what did it feel like in 1943, or what did it feel like in 1985? For that, you have to go back to that bit of history in Berlin in a time machine. Once you get off the time machine, you're going to experience what people felt like then. That's that sequential idea of history, that you can feel the past, within quotes, the past, with immediacy only if you go back in a time machine, is not actually how it happens. What we call the past can be immediate to us at certain points of time and show us that the idea of history as being sequential is not strictly true.
It's I'm really glad that you focused on the time aspect of doing history and understanding it with respect to the novel, and the tours that the narrator is having with his friends. For Cruel, for instance, or Jonas, who was not quite a friend, but when Jonas points at the entire stretch of Tiergarten and says, "You sense what it felt like in 1989." The professor thinks to himself, "This is what home was." So because you elaborated a bit on the time aspect of it, would you also like to speak about what role does space play in weaving history for you?
What role does what? Sorry.
Space play in weaving history for you, because when Jonas is pointing out to the entire stretch of Tiergarten, the narrator is standing in a queue, looks at the entire stretch and just thinks to himself, "This is what home was."
Yeah, right. Because Jonas says to the narrator that if you were looking at this scene in 1989, then the end of Tiergarten over there would be as far as you could see. And there would be, beyond that, you didn't know what was going on. That world didn't exist, or as good as did not exist. And because this is the world in which the narrator grew up, in which there was a horizon beyond which certain things didn't exist imaginatively or ideologically. And over here we are talking about the demarcations that were created by the Iron Curtain, to put it, that's one crude way of looking at it, but the demarcations created by this world in which there was socialism, capitalism, and what fell in between, the non-aligned nations, it meant that we all had our own stretch of the Tiergarten, beyond which we did not concern ourselves with what lay beyond that, except on some sort of theoretical or academic level. And he suddenly realizes, this is the world that I grew up in. We did not realize that the Tiergarten, metaphorically speaking, would ever give way to a world in which it became unbounded. So space, yeah, I've thought of space in so many ways in my work, because I love space. I mean, more than time, maybe, because it's kind of non-linear in a sense. But space is also, as we can see from this discussion we've just had about the Tiergarten and the world that people like the narrator and I grew up in, space is also historical,
Yeah.
And something has changed as far as space is concerned, and certainly with globalization, a lot has changed with where space is concerned.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I've seen you over the years with, in your novels that I've read, and with Sojourn as well, that belonging has often been portrayed in your novels through the focus on everyday. Even in this conversation, when you're talking about, your little memories in different cities, whether, with the feeling of familiarity, or, you're feeling alien, no matter how far or near the city is. The focus often has been on the everyday. So would you talk about the importance of everyday life in a city like Berlin, steeped in turbulent history, as you were saying, in unbuilding identity in the novel. To put it more simply, what role does the everyday life in a historical city like Berlin play in the building or unbuilding of an identity in the novel?
I mean, the word identity, for instance, obviously becomes irrelevant in the novel as a kind of parameter through which we can understand anything. So I'm not critiquing identity as one would critique identity politics. I'm just saying that identity is not always a parameter which sort of illuminates us about our own experience. And when I'm saying our own experience, I don't mean that this is a kind of experience that transcends or exceeds identity. This is historical experience.
Yes.
But we are made up of so many histories, and modernity itself contains so many histories that our kind of suppositions about identity cannot explain, for instance, why the narratives that occur to us, for instance, what I said earlier about feeling at home and not feeling at home in particular locations.
The absorbed feeling.
Yeah, it doesn't, things don't get clarified if we refer to identity. So now, as far as the everyday is concerned, the everyday. I mean, yes, I have always, of course, everybody has said I'm interested in the everyday. I too kind of go along with it. Yes, I'm interested in the everyday. The everyday for me is what is not epic and what is not historical in the sense of overarchingly historical, where we begin to kind of identify history with epic overarching narratives, with important monuments or important occurrences. And we say that what lies outside of that is the everyday.
Absolutely.
Now, Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, I find on rereading it, is saying that, we don't find anything about women in the history books because this is when she's addressing those people in Cambridge, in those Cambridge colleges. We don't find anything. I went to the British Museum and looked up several histories and couldn't find, because within that kind of definition of history, the woman protagonist or player does not figure, because history is composed entirely of the important. So Woolf is making a case there for not just for women, but for the everyday as well, for another conception of history. Of course, it's extremely easy to then have recourse to some other form, fall back on some other form of understanding what history might be by saying that, well, let's look at oral sources, etc., etc. And that also becomes, it becomes a convention. I think Woolf is looking for something more. And so should we, all novelists, all writers, look for something a little more, something that isn't solved so easily. And our works need to be attempts each time, fresh attempts to solve that, to not fall into the easy solution.
Absolutely, yes. And it's not easy to resist the temptation to, focus on these epic overarching moments, as you're saying, especially when one is in Berlin, but you have done it in an absolutely fascinating manner in Sojourn. Another instance in the book, which appealed to me a lot, is when the professor is first given a studio. Because we are nearing towards the end of the conversation, I want to go back to the beginning of the novel, where he arrives in Berlin and he's given a studio that's tiny and not the flat that is assigned to the visiting professor, the 2-bedroom flat. And later he gets the flat. And then when he's in conversation with a friend, he says something in the lines of, because they assume that you come from places like this, places like huts, right? So in the novel, the incident of discrimination contributes to the professor's lived experience, as we were talking about, as you were just telling us about lived experiences. And you have said in one of your writings how in the book, Berlin and Europe become a way of addressing how ethnicity, religion, colonialism, nationality aren't adequate to define who we are. You also said, how identity as a parameter becomes not so relevant. So what role does the history of the city play in conveying this message for you in the novel? Because, these categories are becoming inadequate to define who we are. Certain parameters that are known to us are becoming irrelevant. So yet, you were talking about the overarching epic moments, but the history is still there.
Right. So to go back to the kind of little kind of exchange that he has with somebody he's met about the fact that he was given a studio apartment, and then he asked to be moved to the flat that was due to him, and the other person who's a German says that, well, yeah, they thought it, and he says, why did this happen? Do you think that why was I given this small apartment when they had promised me this other place? And the German acquaintance says, it's probably because they think, this is good enough for you. They think you live in a hut where you came from, and so, but, again, that doesn't encompass everything, that experience. It's part of a series of experiences, but it's a brief throwaway commentary on maybe perception, where a conscious perception, where a German person is concerned of what this person might be or where he might come from. But the story itself, the novel, is meant to unravel all such perceptions, including the fact that that this moment is somehow definitive. This is not a definitive moment. There are all kinds of other moments which point towards different historical configurations, which are not just to do with the fact that, no, I don't just come from a place where people live in huts. None, that's wrong of you. It doesn't. It's meant to unravel those things, because actually the historical configurations and even the confusions are far more complex and rich. Yes. It's only on the surface that these other kind of misprisions are at work, but the actual confusions are not only complex, but certain categories become unusable. For instance, nationality, which is why or post-coloniality, which is why I'm not writing about a migrant, or I'm not writing about an Indian in Berlin, although of course he's an Indian in Berlin, but that's not the story of an Indian man in Berlin. And so as these things unravel as crutches with which to understand such a story, other things surely must be coming up,
Especially like, with Fakhrul, he is a poet in exile. So, I mean, even the focus on him is not about where he's coming from, but his life in the city. So,
yeah. And the various historical processes that create his exile and his move to where he is and what he has become, which has echoes. I mean, he could have been German.
Yeah.
I mean, he needn't have been from Bangladesh. These things have echoes and are parts of conversations across the world, and so that means that other possibilities of understanding history and who we are and even nationality are coming up as those things in their usual kind of sense are being unraveled.
Absolutely. And that is also happening through, the unraveling is happening through the mundane moments, the everyday moments as you define them as, the ones outside the epic overarching moments. And they're happening in the novel in a city that is still steeped in,
Yeah. Because there are only everyday moments in that sense.
Yeah.
I mean, except for this weird thing about the person losing his memory. Yeah. All the everyday moments are also historical.
Absolutely.
The fact that he's watching people dance and he's suddenly unsure of which period of history he's in. All the everyday moments are also exactly what he accesses history through.
Absolutely, and we have referred to the narrator losing his memory, but I'm glad that we did not go deep into it, because I would love for everyone attending to read the novel, because I've been absolutely fascinated by it, and I am aware of the time. So if that was my last question to you. Do you have anything to say about the book that you think was important to be brought up? Because this is everything that I wanted to know, and the answers have been fascinating. So I just want to thank you for your time on behalf of the Oxford History Society. And we look forward to your next novel and the paperback edition when it comes out within a few months, although I have my copy with me. Yes, so if you have anything to say to us.
Thank you so much. I mean, no, I don't have anything to add. I don't know if anybody wants to ask anything, but otherwise, I think your kind of take on it has been pretty, thorough. So I don't need to.
Do we have 5 more minutes if you want to take one question from the audience?
Sure.
So we will be taking one question if you can put it in the chat, and that will be the end of this conversation. And again, we are very thankful for you to take out the time to do this. So we have one question. I'll read that out. It is also on your screen from Digvijay Nikam. Digvijay says, while talking about the sense of familiarity in an unknown place, you said it has a relation to history in some way, which you're trying to think through lately. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't think I'll be able to elaborate on it in a kind of satisfying way in 5 minutes. But to go back to sort of the examples I gave of feeling a certain sense of recognition, but also a sense of mystery in Bhawanipur, but also I felt it in other places, like including Geneva or Berlin. It might have to do with the fact that, what are the histories that have produced these places? How come they're not completely explained by colonial history? So let me just give you a kind of simple thought, and not really answer your question properly, but just raise another question. So the question would be, in Calcutta, Bhawanipur, which I'm talking about, the houses came up in the early 20th century. They were built by Bengali professionals mostly, unknown builders, but for homeowners who were Bengali professionals who worked with the builder to create those houses. The houses, as I said, were 2 or 3 storied, and they were somewhat different from the houses in North Calcutta, which landowners had built after the move to Calcutta, and they were built with a mixture of Indian Haveli elements, but also neoclassical elements. And they were also, of course, different from colonial bungalows. So the early 20th century houses that were built by professors and barristers and doctors in the south of Calcutta had some of them had Art Deco elements, and all of them had red stone floors, red oxidized stone floors, and green slatted windows. And they had round knockers on doors. All of them had perforations in a kind of pattern on the sides of some of the walls, which served as ventilators. They all had open rooftops. They all had long verandas, but no 2 houses were identical.
That's
in a lake.
Yes.
Each house was different from the other. Okay, so that's the kind of place you see when you go to South Calcutta, Bhawanipur. It is possible that you don't look at these houses properly, because many people think Calcutta, second city of the empire, it must be a prototype of London. When you go to London, nothing accounts for Calcutta.
Nothing, yes.
Nothing accounts for those houses. So the question is, how much can we lose if we only, within quotes, understand things according to the kind of itineraries that we've been taught or have been given to us? What we can lose is we can stop seeing and attending to our own experience of seeing. So I know people who say, well, Calcutta, of course, it's all explained when you go to London, why it is what it is. While actually questions open up when you go to London as to why those 2 places are so unlike and why they constitute such different conceptions of place and history. So this is what I mean. Let's look at the question once again.
Yes.
Yeah, the historicality then is something that is a question. The historicality is a question which we might stop thinking about or even may not be aware of, because an itinerary has been given to us, a history has been given to us, and therefore, when we look at Calcutta, we believe we are seeing a prototype of London, and we forget to look. And our experience is full of how we suppress experience because of certain trajectories and histories being given to us prefabricated. For instance, if we think that the modern age is an age of trauma, at least the West has said it's an age of trauma and disenchantment, then what we will do is when we read Kafka, we will see Kafka as his stories as an allegory of that trauma. And we will completely miss the humor and the sensuousness of Kafka. When we reread him, we will suddenly think, oh no, he's actually a very funny writer. And not only that, he's a very realistic writer and a very precise writer, and he knows how to write about rooms and streets and food. Metamorphosis has some wonderful kind of descriptions of rotting food, because it's only rotting food that will appeal to Gregor Samsa, as his sister realizes, after he's turned into this giant insect. But we will miss all that, because we'll keep seeing the giant insect as some sort of key symbol of Western historical and personal trauma. And we will miss the delight Kafka has taken in the portrayal of the rotting food that is served up to Gregor. So what I'm saying is that when we consume or subscribe to prefabricated histories, we stop seeing the historicality of what's actually diversely around us. And that what is around us is not properly explained by those histories, whether it's a history of the nation or of colonialism or whatever. They are not properly explained. Those histories then begin to unravel. When we finally begin to think to ourselves, hang on, the green slatted windows.
Sorry.
The green slatted windows, I've never seen them in London. Hang on, I've never seen that. And then you begin to rethink the map.
That is so beautiful. That is, I mean, there is nothing I can say that can, that is worth listening to after this, except to say thank you, not only for your time, but for your reference to my home city, Calcutta. And we will end, I really wish we could carry on the conversation longer, but as we saw in the conversation today, time plays a very important role, unfortunately. And so with the memory of Calcutta and the memory of the professor in Berlin in the novel Sojourn, we will conclude this conversation. Thank you to everyone who attended, and to you again, Professor, for this absolutely amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
Lovely. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks. Bye-bye.